Before the trucks started showing up late at night, before the strange lights and hushed conversations, Greenville was just a normal, quiet town. But weird things have a way of sneaking in. First, one truck arrived at midnight, then another, and then some more. Something was hiding under Shaq's big mansion. It all started on a warm spring evening. Mrs. Peterson, wearing her favorite cardigan even though it wasn't cold, took Max, her tiny Yorkshire Terrier, out for their usual walk. The sun was low, casting a golden glow on the sidewalks. Everything felt normal, calm, but then, just for a second, she saw something odd, something that was out of place. She was about to head home when a huge truck, which was way bigger than any delivery truck she'd ever seen in their quiet, fancy neighborhood, rolled down the street. The clock had just hit midnight. Its headlights sliced through the darkness, bright and almost blinding, as it slowed to a stop right in front of Shaq's massive villa. Mrs. Peterson hesitated. Something about it felt off. She tightened her grip on Max's leash and quickly stepped behind a thick oak tree. Normally, she'd be in the comfort of her home and fast asleep by now, but she couldn't look away. What happened next had the whole neighborhood talking for months. A group of men jumped out of the truck, all dressed in dark clothes. Their hands were covered in gloves, and masks hid their faces. They moved quickly, barely making a sound like they had done this 100 times before. Every few seconds, one of them would glance over their shoulder, checking the empty street, like they felt someone watching. Frozen in place, she knew she could be in danger because of what she saw, but she couldn't get her feet to move. Max, sensing her distress, barked at her. That got her feet moving. The next morning over coffee, Mrs. Peterson told her best friend Sandra what she had seen the previous night, and Sandra's eyes widened with every detail revealed. She had seen the same kind of truck 3 nights ago. It wasn't long before other neighbors started sharing their own strange stories. Tommy, the 12-year-old paper boy, had noticed something weird too. Every morning, just before the sun came up, Shaq's driveway had fresh, wet tire tracks. But there hadn't been any rain. Soon, people started to see a pattern. Every night, right when the old grandfather clock in the town square struck midnight, the trucks came. Sometimes they carried big, heavy containers into the house. Other times, they took different ones out. The men barely spoke, just whispered to each other as they moved like shadows. During the day, smaller vehicles showed up. They didn't follow a schedule, but the routine stayed the same. Empty containers went in, full ones came out. The daytime workers didn't wear masks like the night crew, but they were just as fast, slipping in and out before anyone could get a good look. Mr. Johnson, who lived right next door to Shaq, started writing down the late-night visits in his journal. He noticed a pattern. The trucks came more often on clear nights and almost never when it was stormy. Some nights, there weren't just 1 or 2, he counted up to 4. The neighborhood, once warm and friendly, was starting to feel weird. Everyone had welcomed Shaq when he moved in. He was generous, always showing up at barbecues, helping decorate the town's Christmas tree. But now, with all the strange things happening around his house, people couldn't help but wonder what was really going on behind those fancy gates. There were some weird rumors going around about Shaq's house. Little Jenny from across the street claimed she saw green smoke coming out of his chimney, but her parents thought she was just imagining things. Then Mr. Collins, a retired cop, said that Shaq's sprinklers would sometimes turn on in the middle of the night, which seemed kinda strange. As the weeks passed, things got even stranger. The trucks got bigger, the visits more frequent, the workers moved faster, almost like they were in a rush. The neighborhood watch, usually busy with lost pets and misplaced mail, was suddenly overwhelmed with reports about Shaq's house. Every morning there was a new story, a new theory, a new reason to be suspicious. No one wanted to think badly of Shaq, but the more they saw, the harder it became to ignore the feeling that something strange, something big was happening at his house. Then one Tuesday night, 10-year-old Billy Anderson was up late working on his science project when something caught his eye. Through his bedroom window, bright blue beams of light shot up from behind Shaq's villa, cutting through the dark sky like tiny northern lights. His dad, Mr. Anderson, came to check. Coffee mug in hand, the lights flickered and changed. Blue, then green, then a strange shade of purple. They disappeared, then suddenly reappeared somewhere else. For 2 weeks in a row, the lights came back every night, Some neighbors said they looked like something out of an underwater documentary. Others thought they seemed like special effects from a science fiction movie. Mrs. Wilson, the middle school science teacher, noticed something strange. The lights were always brightest when the sky was cloudy. Then came the smell. At first it was just a faint fishy odor, barely noticeable but enough to make people wrinkle their noses when they walked past Shaq's house. But soon it got worse. Thick, heavy, and impossible to ignore. It clung to the air, like the smell of the ocean at low tide, only mixed with something no one could quite describe. The weekly book club, usually held on Sarah's patio, had to move indoors even though the weather was perfect. Mr. Roberts, proud of his award-winning roses, found his precious flowers wilting near the fence that bordered Shaq's yard. Even the neighborhood cats, usually bold and curious, refused to go near that side of the street. People tried to be patient. After all, Shaq had always been a good neighbor, helping Mrs. Thompson with her groceries, coaching the kids' basketball games, and donating to local events. But between the strange lights and the awful smell, patience was starting to run out, and fast. At the next neighborhood meeting, someone finally said what everyone had been thinking. What on earth was going on at Shaq's house? The usual calm gathering turned into a mess of wild guesses. Maybe he was building a fancy indoor pool, or a high-tech training center, or even a secret lab. Tom Martinez, the neighborhood association president, finally got everyone to settle down. He had a simple idea. Why not just ask Shaq? They decided to put together a small group of trusted neighbors to go straight to the source. They picked 5 people: a doctor, a retired teacher, a small bust howiness owner, the community garden organizer, and, surprisingly, shy Ms. Peters, the town's longest resident. The next morning, the group walked up Shaq's long driveway. Their hearts pounded as they practiced what to say, hoping for a simple answer that would put everyone at ease. But as they reached for the doorbell, one question lingered in the air. What happens if the answer they get is not as simple and worse than they had imagined? There was only one way to find out. They rang the bell again and again, but no one answered. Shaq wasn't home. Even no one said it out loud. They were relieved he wasn't home, and as they left with the promise to check back later, they all knew they would. While the neighborhood committee was busy planning their meeting with Shaq, one person had already made up her mind about what was going on. Miss Janice Thompson, from the big blue house 3 doors down, had been watching Shaq's place for weeks, binoculars in hand, taking notes like a detective in a mystery novel. At 62, with perfect silver hair and a wardrobe full of designer outfits, Miss Janice had once been the top real estate agent in town. But after 3 messy marriages, she didn't trust anyone. Her first husband had left lipstick stains on his collar and love letters in his briefcase. The second? He walked away because she kept checking his phone, convinced he was hiding something. And the third? He didn't even pretend to love her, just snuck cash from her purse when he thought she wasn't looking. Now she spent her days tending to her award-winning orchids and writing down everything that happened in the neighborhood. What started as a simple gardening journal had turned into something else entirely, a full-blown record of every late-night truck, every visitor, and every odd thing happening at Shaq's house. One warm evening, while watering her orchids, she heard something unusual, voices raised and tense coming from Shaq's property. She froze. 2 men stood near the garage, their deep voices sharp against the quiet night. The sun was low, their shadows stretching long across the driveway. Miss Janice set down her watering can and moved closer to the fence, her heart pounding. Something wasn't right. She held her breath, pressing herself against the wooden panels, straining to hear every word. Then one voice, frustrated and low, cut through the air. The boss won't be happy about this. The second voice, defensive and quick, pushed back. It wasn't his fault the system had malfunctioned. A heavy silence hung between them. Neither one spoke for a long time. Then in a low warning tone, the first man spoke again. They had to fix it, or they were all in trouble. Miss Janice's hands shook as she quickly jotted down the conversation in her little pink notebook. Every word felt important. The next morning, she called her old friend Betty at the county clerk's office, keeping her tone light and friendly. Just a small favor. Could Betty check if any new permits had been issued for Shaquille O'Neal's property? That one call turned into a full day of digging. She reached out to old real estate contacts, asking about zoning laws, construction permits, anything that might explain what was going on. By nightfall, her dining table was buried under piles of notes, printouts, and legal documents. Every evening after that, Miss Janice took her usual spot by the window, chamomile tea in hand, watching the trucks come and go from Shaq's driveway. Her nightly walks, once just for fresh air, now had a purpose. With her tiny dog Precious trotting ahead, she strolled past Shaq's house, eyes sharp, looking for any new clues. Then came the moment that changed everything. Determined to get answers, she tried to join Shaq on his evening jog. Wearing her best designer running shoes and full makeup, she lasted about 3 minutes before gasping for air. Shaq, jogging effortlessly beside her, answered her pointed questions with polite, calm responses. That only made her more suspicious. That night, sitting at her antique desk, surrounded by her porcelain cat collection, Miss Janice made up her mind. She picked up the phone and called the police. Her voice shook a little, but she didn't hesitate. Whatever was going on behind those mansion walls, she was going to find out, even if it meant taking on an NBA legend. The moonlight washed over Greenville's quiet streets as police cars pulled up to Shaq's massive mansion. Their flashing red and blue lights danced across perfectly trimmed hedges, turning the peaceful neighborhood into something out of a crime show. Curtains shifted, neighbors peeked out, and whispers filled the air as people stepped onto their porches, drawn to the commotion. Miss Janice stood near the edge of the crowd, her heart pounding. She had made the call, certain that something strange was happening behind those grand doors. Now, as Shaq stepped onto his porch, his towering frame nearly filling the doorway, he greeted the officers with a calm, friendly smile. That smile only made her more suspicious. With a deep, steady voice, Shaq invited them inside. He didn't look nervous, not even a little, which made Miss Janice's stomach twist. A few brave neighbors followed behind the officers, determined to uncover the truth. Inside, the house looked normal, cozy even. Family photos lined the walls. Championship trophies gleamed in glass cases. The air smelled like fresh wood polish and faint traces of cologne. Nothing seemed out of place. Then Shaq led them to a heavy wooden door. His massive hand rested on the knob for just a moment before he spoke. There was something they needed to see. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase leading underground. The group hesitated. Shaq started down first, his broad shoulders barely fitting through the narrow passage. The officers followed. Their footsteps echoed against the concrete walls. At first, the basement looked ordinary. Boxes stacked in corners, old gym equipment, a few dusty trophies. But then, Shaq walked toward another door, a thick metal one, locked tight. Miss Janice sucked in a breath as Shaq pulled out a key ring. Even the officers exchanged uneasy glances. The heavy door groaned open, revealing something no one expected. A tunnel. Wide, clean, brightly lit. The walls were smooth, lined with modern ventilation. It stretched deep underground, disappearing into the distance. They followed Shaq down the passage, the soft hum of running water growing louder. Then the tunnel opened up into a massive underground chamber, and what they saw made everyone freeze. Not a secret lab, not a hidden vault, not anything illegal. It was a fish farm. Rows of large, crystal-clear ponds stretched across the space. Schools of fish swam lazily under glowing lights. The air smelled fresh, the water perfectly filtered. Faces filled with confusion, the group turned to Shaq. With a calm smile, he explained. He had discovered these old tunnels beneath his property and turned them into something meaningful. A high-tech fish farm, not for business, not for fame, but for something much bigger. Every morning, trucks quietly delivered fresh fish from his hidden farm to homeless shelters across the city, providing meals for people in need. The late-night trucks, the mysterious containers, the strange lights, it all made sense now. Shaq had been running a secret operation, not for himself, not for profit, but to help people, expecting nothing in return. The officers lowered their notepads. The tension in the air vanished. Even Miss Janice stood in stunned silence, her weeks of suspicion dissolving as she watched the fish glide peacefully through the water. Beneath Shaq's grand home, they hadn't uncovered a scandal. They had discovered kindness, hidden in plain sight. Miss Janice wasn't sure what to expect, but nothing could have prepared her for what she saw that morning. A long line of people stretched down the sidewalk, wrapping around the block. They stood patiently, shifting from foot to foot in the early morning chill, waiting for breakfast. Some clutched worn jackets tighter around their shoulders. Others quietly talked among themselves, offering tired smiles and small moments of warmth. Near the front of the line stood Sarah, a young mother with dark circles under her eyes. She held her two little ones close, their clothes slightly too big, their tiny hands gripping the hem of her sweater. They huddled together, their faces full of quiet exhaustion. Behind them, an elderly man, Mr. Chen, leaned on his cane. His kind but weary eyes told a story of a life that had once been stable, a good job, a home, a sense of security until a string of bad luck had taken it all away. Miss Janice looked down the line. Every face carried a different story. Some had lost their jobs, others had battled illnesses, unexpected tragedies, or simply the relentless weight of life's struggles. Yet despite everything, hope still clung to them, fragile but unbroken. Inside the shelter, the kitchen buzzed with movement. Volunteers worked in a well-rehearsed rhythm, stirring steaming pots, flipping sizzling fish fillets, and carefully arranging warm, nourishing meals onto trays. The air smelled of freshly baked bread, rich broth, and the crisp, golden scent of perfectly cooked fish. Maria, the head chef, wiped her hands on her apron and smiled as she looked at Miss Janice. She explained how, before Shaq's deliveries, the shelter had mostly relied on canned food. Fresh meals had been a rare luxury, something they could only offer occasionally. Despite their best efforts, resources had always been limited. As she glanced toward the long line stretching outside, her expression softened. Now, things were different. People no longer came just out of necessity, they looked forward to the meals. The food wasn't just nourishment, it restored a sense of dignity to those who needed it most. Miss Janice watched as a little girl received her plate, hesitating for a brief moment before taking a careful bite. Her eyes widened with surprise and a delighted, gap-toothed grin spread across her face. Beside her, her mother reached for her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. A quiet whisper followed, a soft acknowledgement that this meal was better than what they used to have at home. Miss Janice felt something shift inside her. For so long, she had viewed the world through suspicion, searching for hidden motives, waiting for people to prove her right. But here, in this warm, bustling shelter, she saw something else: kindness and quiet generosity. The next week, Miss Janice did something no one expected. She volunteered. She traded her designer dresses for a simple apron, tied her silver hair back, and rolled up her sleeves. The first day felt strange, foreign even. She fumbled with the ladle, nearly spilled a tray of soup, and winced at how sore her feet felt by the afternoon. But then she saw the smiles, heard the quiet thank yous, and felt something soften inside her. Soon others in the neighborhood followed. Mr. Johnson, the retired accountant, stepped in to organize the shelter's finances, making sure donations were tracked and budgets balanced. Mrs. Peterson, a former teacher, started free cooking classes, teaching families how to make simple, affordable meals with fresh ingredients. Even young Tommy, the neighborhood paperboy, began spending his Saturdays sorting food donations, stacking cans and boxes with surprising dedication. The very people who once whispered about Shaq's strange house, the late-night trucks, the eerie lights, the secret tunnels were now working side by side, making a difference. Shaq's underground fish farm hadn't just fed people, it had changed the entire neighborhood. And Miss Janice? She had changed too. She started talking to her neighbors instead of watching them through binoculars. Her little pink notebook, once filled with notes of suspicion and gossip, now held recipes, names of shelter visitors, and little stories she wanted to remember. She still had an eye for detail, but now she used it to notice the good instead of hunting for the bad. One afternoon, while leaving the shelter, she met an orange tabby cat curled up in a sun patch on the steps. The shelter staff explained that the cat had belonged to a man who had recently found stable housing. He had begged them to find his furry friend a loving home. Without hesitation, Miss Janice scooped the cat into her arms, gently scratching behind its ear. She held it close, feeling the warmth of its small body. In that moment, she realized she could use a little company after all. The cat settled into her home like it had always belonged there, curling up by the window, soaking in the sunlight. A year later, Hope Haven hosted a special dinner to celebrate serving its 100,000th meal. The dining hall was packed. People laughed, shared stories, and clinked cups together in quiet celebration. The scent of freshly cooked fish filled the air, rich and comforting. Miss Janice sat next to Shaq, watching families eat, their faces no longer filled with worry, at least for tonight. She turned to him, her voice softer than usual. For so many years, she had spent her time searching for lies and secrets, never noticing how much kindness had been right in front of her all along. Shaq smiled as he handed her a plate of golden, crispy fish. Sometimes the best secrets weren't the ones people tried to hide. They were the ones that brought people together. If a secret fish farm could change a whole community, what other quiet acts of kindness might be happening around us? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching. We will see you in the next video.